The story begins. Chapter 1, The Perfect Facade. Sarah stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of her blouse. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen. James had left for work hours ago, as usual, without so much as a goodbye kiss. She sighed, running a hand through her auburn hair. At 35, she still turned heads, but lately, she felt invisible, especially to her husband. The sound of her phone buzzing snapped her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Mark, an old college friend she'd reconnected with on Facebook a few weeks ago. "Good morning, beautiful. How's your day going?" Sarah smiled despite herself. Mark had a way of making her feel seen, something she hadn't felt in years. She typed a quick reply, her heart fluttering as she hit send. Chapter 2, The Growing Distance. James sat at his desk, staring at the stack of case files in front of him. The office was quiet, the faint hum of the air conditioner the only sound. He rubbed his temples, trying to push away the headache that had been building all morning. He thought about Sarah. Lately, their conversations had been reduced to mundane exchanges about the kids and household chores. He knew he'd been distant, but the pressure at work was relentless. He told himself it was temporary, that once he made partner, things would get better. But deep down, he wondered if it was already too late. Chapter 3, The First Betrayal. Sarah sat across from Mark at a cozy cafe downtown. The air between them was charged with unspoken tension. Mark reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers. "I've missed you, Sarah," he said softly. She looked away, guilt gnawing at her. "Mark, I'm married. I have kids. This can't happen." "But it already is," he replied, his eyes locking onto hers. Sarah's heart raced. She knew she was crossing a line, but the attention, the affection, it was intoxicating. For the first time in years, she felt alive. Chapter 4, The Weight of Guilt. Sarah returned home that evening, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. The house was quiet, the kids already asleep. She tiptoed into the kitchen, where James sat at the table, scrolling through his phone. "Hey," she said softly, trying to sound normal. James looked up, his eyes tired but kind. "Hey. How was your day?" "Fine," she replied too quickly, avoiding his gaze. "Just ran some errands." James nodded, seemingly oblivious to her unease. "I ordered pizza for the kids. There's some left if you're hungry." Sarah forced a smile. "Thanks." As she reheated a slice, she couldn't shake the image of Mark's face, the way his hand had felt against hers. She glanced at James, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, and a pang of guilt shot through her. "What am I doing?" she thought. "This isn't me." But then she remembered the way James had barely looked at her over the past year, the way he dismissed her concerns about their marriage. The guilt began to fade, replaced by a simmering resentment. Chapter 5, The Private Investigator. James sat in his car outside the office, staring at the business card in his hand. Private investigator, discreet and professional. He'd picked it up on a whim, but now he wasn't so sure. Was he really considering this? Spying on his own wife? But the signs were there, the late-night texts, the sudden interest in her appearance, the way she'd been distant lately. He couldn't ignore it anymore. With a deep breath, he dialed the number. Chapter 6, The Affair Deepens. Sarah met Mark again, this time at a secluded park. The autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet as they walked, their hands brushing occasionally. "I can't stop thinking about you," Mark admitted, his voice low. Sarah's heart raced. "Me neither. But it's wrong. I have a family." Mark stopped walking and turned to face her. "Are you happy, Sarah? Really happy?" The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came out. Mark stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. You deserve to be happy. And if James isn't making you feel that way. Sarah's resolve wavered. Before she could stop herself, she leaned in, and their lips met in a kiss that was equal parts passion and desperation. Chapter 7, The Investigation Begins. James sat across from the private investigator, a man named Carl, in a dimly lit diner. Carl slid a folder across the table. I've been following her for a week, Carl said. She's been meeting a man named Mark. They've been seen together multiple times, coffee shops, parks, even a hotel. James's stomach churned as he flipped through the photos. There was Sarah, laughing with Mark, holding his hand, kissing him. His hands trembled as he closed the folder. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Carl nodded sympathetically. I'm sorry, man. Chapter 8, The Confrontation. Sarah was in the kitchen when James came home early. She turned, surprised to see him. Hey, what are you doing home so early? She asked, trying to sound casual. James didn't respond. Instead, he tossed the folder onto the counter. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the photos inside. James, she began, but he cut her off. How long? He demanded, his voice shaking with anger. Sarah looked away, tears welling in her eyes. It's not what you think. Don't lie to me. James shouted, slamming his hand on the counter. I trusted you, Sarah. I gave you everything. Sarah flinched, the weight of her betrayal crashing down on her. I'm sorry, she whispered. James stared at her, his eyes filled with pain and disbelief. Sorry? You're sorry? Do you have any idea what you've done? Chapter 9, The Fallout. The days that followed were a blur of arguments, tears, and silence. The kids, sensing the tension, became withdrawn and anxious. Sarah moved into the guest room, while James threw himself into work, trying to numb the pain. One night, James came home to find Sarah packing a suitcase. What are you doing? He asked, his voice hollow. Sarah paused, her hands trembling. I think I need some space. For the kids' sake. James laughed bitterly. For the kids' sake? Don't pretend this is about them. This is about you and your selfish choices. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I never meant to hurt you, James. I felt so alone. And now you've made sure I feel the same way, he replied, his voice breaking. Chapter 10, The Crossroads. Sarah stood at the door, her suitcase in hand. She looked back at James, who sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. I'll call the kids tomorrow, she said softly. James didn't respond. As she walked out the door, Sarah wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. But deep down, she knew there was no going back. Chapter 11, The Children's Pain. Emily, their 8-year-old daughter, sat on the edge of her bed, clutching her stuffed bunny. She could hear her parents arguing downstairs, their voices muffled but angry. Her younger brother, Liam, was asleep in the next room, oblivious to the tension. Emily wiped her tears and tiptoed to the door, peeking into the hallway. She saw her mom carrying a suitcase down the stairs, her face streaked with tears. Mommy? Emily called out, her voice trembling. Sarah froze, her heart breaking at the sight of her daughter. She set the suitcase down and knelt in front of Emily. Hey, sweetheart, Sarah said, forcing a smile. Why are you up so late? Are you leaving? Emily asked, her big brown eyes filled with fear. Sarah hesitated, unsure of how to explain. Mommy just needs to take a little break, okay? But I'll see you and Liam very soon. Emily's lip quivered. But why? Did Daddy do something bad? Sarah pulled her daughter into a tight hug. No, baby. Daddy didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups need time to figure things out. Emily clung to her mother, crying softly. I don't want you to go. Sarah's heart ached as she held her daughter, wondering if she was making the right choice. Chapter 12, James's Descent. After Sarah left, James sat alone in the living room, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. The house felt eerily quiet, the absence of Sarah's presence like a gaping wound. He replayed the last few months in his mind, trying to pinpoint where things had gone wrong. Had he been too focused on work? Had he taken Sarah for granted? But no matter how much he blamed himself, he couldn't shake the image of Sarah and Mark together. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he'd ever experienced. He poured himself another drink, his hands shaking. For the first time in his life, he felt truly alone. Chapter 13, Sarah's New Reality. Sarah moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. The space felt cold and unfamiliar, a stark contrast to the home she'd shared with James and the kids. Mark called her that evening, his voice warm and reassuring. How are you holding up? He asked. Sarah sighed, sinking into the couch. I don't know. I feel like I've ruined everything. You didn't ruin anything, Mark said firmly. You deserve to be happy, Sarah. And if James couldn't see that, then that's on him. Sarah wanted to believe him, but the guilt still gnawed at her. She thought about Emily and Liam, their innocent faces filled with confusion and pain. I just hope the kids will be okay, she said quietly. They will be, Mark assured her. Kids are resilient. And you're still their mom. Nothing will change that. Chapter 14, The First Visit. A week later, Sarah picked up Emily and Liam for their first visit since the separation. The kids were quiet in the car, their usual chatter replaced by an uneasy silence. When they arrived at the apartment, Liam ran to the couch, his eyes wide with curiosity. Is this your new house, Mommy? He asked. Sarah forced a smile. It's just a place for me to stay for a little while. Do you like it? Liam nodded, but Emily stayed by the door, her arms crossed. Why can't we stay with you? Emily asked, her voice tinged with anger. Sarah knelt in front of her daughter. I know this is hard, sweetheart. But Daddy and I need some time apart. That doesn't mean we love you any less. Emily's eyes filled with tears. But I want us to be a family again. Sarah pulled her daughter into a hug, her own tears falling. I know, baby. I want that too. Chapter 15, James's Revelation. James sat in his therapist's office, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I just don't know how to move forward, he admitted. Every time I think about her, I feel so angry, but also so sad. Dr. Patel nodded, her expression empathetic. Betrayal is one of the most painful experiences a person can go through. But it's important to remember that healing is a process. It's okay to feel angry, but don't let that anger consume you. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. I just keep wondering, was it my fault? Did I push her away? Dr. Patel leaned forward. It's natural to question yourself in situations like this. But the truth is, relationships are complicated. Both partners play a role in what happens. The important thing now is to focus on yourself and your children. James nodded, though the weight of his guilt and pain still felt overwhelming. Chapter 16, A Glimmer of Hope. One evening, Sarah and James found themselves face to face at Emily's school play. They sat on opposite sides of the auditorium, but their eyes met during the performance. Afterward, as they waited for Emily outside the classroom, James broke the silence. She did great tonight, he said, his voice soft. Sarah nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. She's always loved being on stage. There was a pause, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. "James," Sarah began, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. For everything." James looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and longing. "I'm sorry too. I should have been there for you." For a moment, it felt like they were seeing each other for the first time in years, not as adversaries, but as two people who had once loved each other deeply. Chapter 17, The Road Ahead. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, Sarah and James began to find a new rhythm. They attended family therapy with the kids, working to rebuild trust and create a sense of stability. Sarah ended things with Mark, realizing that her affair had been a symptom of deeper issues in her marriage. James, in turn, made an effort to be more present, both for the kids and for himself. One evening, as they sat together at Emily's soccer game, James turned to Sarah. "Do you think we'll ever be able to forgive each other?" he asked. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "I don't know. But I think we owe it to ourselves, and to the kids, to try." James nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "Then let's try." Epilogue, A New Beginning. The story ends with Sarah and James standing at a crossroads, their future uncertain but filled with possibilities. They've learned that love isn't always enough, but with effort and understanding, it can be rebuilt. As they walked away from the soccer field, hand in hand with Emily and Liam, they took the first steps toward a new chapter, one defined not by their past mistakes, but by their willingness to grow and heal.